Shri Tejveer Singh, Additional Chief Secretary, Local Governance, among other charges, to introduce the speaker and to set the context for today's interaction.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I've been entrusted the very pleasant duty of introducing our very distinguished speaker for the evening, Professor Karthik Muralidharan, to you by the Director General of the Institute, Mr. Anirudh Tiwari. Well, at a personal level, my association with Karthik goes back to 2010, when I first invited him to address mid-career participants at the Academy in Mussoorie. Of course, much water has flowed since, and Karthik has come to be recognized as one of the more reflective and influential commentators on governance and state capacity in India. Allow me to quickly give you a snapshot of his rather enviable achievements. Professor Karthik Muralidharan is an economist by training and a well-acclaimed commentator on public policy. He completed his Bachelor of Arts, which in Harvard University is called as AB. It's quite complex, so I'll just give that a miss. With Summa Cum Laude, which is the highest level of honors. This is from the Harvard University. He went on to do his MPhil in economics from the University of Cambridge, where he was placed first, and later his PhD in economics from Harvard University again. Karthik joined the University of California, San Diego as Assistant Professor of Economics in 2008 and rose quickly to become a tenured professor in 2018 and currently serves there as Tata Chancellor's Professor of Economics. He has been teaching public economics, labor economics and development economics and lecturing and writing on various public policy issues in India for almost 2 decades now. He is a research associate of the National Bureau of Economic Research, NBER, in the United States. It's quite prestigious. He serves on the board of directors of JPAL at MIT, where he is co-chair of the Education Research Program and a fellow and board member of the Bureau of Economic Analysis of Development, BRED, besides many other accolades to his credit. It is also noteworthy to mention that Karthik has truly walked the talk and gone on to establish, along with Ashish Dhawan, a distinguished philanthropist and social entrepreneur in his own right, the Center for Effective Governance of Indian States, with a mission to, and I quote, this is from their website, "We aim to improve lives by partnering with state governments to deliver better development outcomes. CEGIS believes that strengthening the capacity of state governments is the most cost-effective way of improving development outcomes at scale." Unquote. Today, Karthik will be sharing some insight from his seminal work, which Bala just mentioned. It's on the screen. Accelerating India's Development, a state-led roadmap for effective governance, that was published last year and has been very well received. Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together to formally welcome Professor Karthik Muralidharan.
Thank you, Tejveer. The stage is all yours, Professor.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Thanks to Tejveer, thanks to Vidiman, and thanks to everyone who's here. It's a real pleasure. It's actually my first. I visited Chandigarh as a tourist for a day and a half. Well, even that doesn't count because we landed here in Amritsar and then just flew out. But it's a pleasure to be here for 2.5 days. I'm at Laksha tomorrow, ISB day after, and it's wonderful to be here. So as Tejvi said, I think, I'm going to take only about 35 to 40 minutes. I could easily go for hours because each of these topics are things that require a lifetime of both research and understanding. But what this book is, it's trying to synthesize about 20 years of work of research, practice, policy advising into kind of a roadmap that brings together both a conceptual and practical roadmap, okay, for how we need to accelerate India's development. So that's the book. So let's get started. So at a big picture, right? At a big picture, when you think about India, there is a lot to be proud of, okay? So we are one of the fastest growing large economy in the world. The macro stability is something to be envied. We never defaulted in our debt, which is not something that even countries in the neighborhood can say. The size, the demographics, the diaspora, all of these are huge kind of assets for India in the global stage. So there's a reason why we are steadily growing up the ranks in terms of the size of the economy. So there is a lot to be proud of, okay? But at the same time, we also face profound challenges that hurt both growth and development. And most of these have to do with basic public service delivery, right? So education, we have 50% of children completing primary school in rural India without being able to read at a second standard level. Nutrition, you have 35% stunting rates, which is among the highest in the world. So India has more stunted children than any other country in the world. Now, at one level, this is good news because it means that you're reducing infant mortality and children who would not have survived are now surviving. But they're surviving but not thriving. And that's because you're not kind of intervening early enough, okay? Public safety, the police are understaffed, overworked, undertrained, and chronically stressed. The court system is a train wreck, right, with a backlog of over 30 million cases, to the point that essentially when we think about why private investment is not picking up, that's actually one of the key issues, that rule of law itself, has become increasingly questionable because of the poor functioning of the justice system. The welfare system exists, but it's creaky, and every state, every part of the country is kind of facing this crisis of how do you create high quality jobs, okay? So when you look at the big picture of India, therefore, right, the overall story, the simple story of the Indian economy is, if you look at the reports put out by analysts like the Indus report that analyze the entire Indian economy, what they do is they basically say that, listen, yes, it is true that we are a lower middle income country with a GDP per capita of about $2,700. But if you break it down, there's really three distinct Indias. Okay? There's an India 1, that's about 10%, that has a per capita income of about $15,000. Okay? So it's that India 1 that drives both the demand and the growth. Okay? Then you've got another 25 to 30% that they call India 2, with a GDP per capita of about $3,000. And that segment is mainly in service sector jobs of varying quality, supporting the demand created by that top 10%. Okay, so if any of you have domestic help who's earning 20,000 rupees a month, that person is already here. Okay, in that next 25%, right? And then you've got a bottom 65 to 70% who are actually at sub-Saharan African levels, who are at about $1,000 per head. Okay, that's literally about around 80,000, and they're mainly left out and supported by welfare programs. Okay. And it's because of these numbers that the politics of the country is now fundamentally about who can announce the bigger welfare schemes, because that's where the numbers are. Okay? So that's the process by which the Indian democracy is distributing some of the benefits of development. Okay? Now, at some level, this is not a bad model. Okay? And the good news is that 10% of India is still a lot of people. That's 140 million people, right? So that's big enough to power innovation, power some of the world's most incredible startups, whether it's the kind of clusters you see, the GCCs. So that is an incredible asset. Okay, so this is, and at one level, this is the normal trajectory of development in most countries. That I am less concerned about inequality per se, because as part of the growth process, it is natural that when everybody is poor, you have high equality. And then as part of the growth process, it's normal that the growth is disproportionately driven by people with physical capital, financial capital, human capital. Okay? And it's also normal for the democratic process to distribute. So the larger point is not that this is a problem, is that this is not enough. Okay? That you cannot function at full potential if half your population can't read at a second standard level. Okay? So getting from 6% to 8, 9, 10% growth, which is what we need in the next 15, 20 years, because remember, the demographic dividend is already kind of declining in many states. And as of 2047, we will probably have a declining population nationally, right? So this 15 years becomes incredibly important. And so when you look at what it takes to get to full potential, we are constrained by weak government effectiveness in delivering public goods and services. And again, the Indian state, just like the Indian economy is bipolar, the Indian state is also bipolar, right? So in mission mode, the Indian government is the most amazing creature in the world, okay? Like, I mean, it does the most impressive vaccination drives, censuses, we do the logistics of the Kumbh Mela, we do some of the world's best disaster relief. So in mission mode, when you have time-bound targets, when the entire machinery of the state is focused on getting certain things done, we are incredible, okay? But it's in the day-to-day delivery of routine services that we are kind of found wanting, okay? And so there have been significant improvements in state capacity in some areas in the past decade, especially when we use technology to bypass the layers of the state and go directly to the beneficiary, right? But where you have human intermediated delivery of services, education, health, police, courts, those are the areas where we still have a very long way to go, okay? So here is kind of a nice quote from Rakesh Mohan, who's one of the architects of the 91 economic reforms, when he was writing this review article, reviewing 25 years of the Indian economy, where he said, listen, at this point, the way forward for accelerated growth in India is being held back by major governance deficits in all areas connected with the delivery of public goods and services, okay? And Land Pritchard, who many of you know, is always more dramatic, okay? So this is Land in 2008, saying that the weak performance of the Indian state is one of the 10 greatest challenges facing humanity. Okay? And the logic of that is both the number of people affected and the sheer scale of the problem and the intractability of the problem. Okay? So my own assessment, and the reason for writing this book, is as we assess India at 75, there really is no greater barrier to achieving full potential, okay, than improving the effectiveness of the Indian state. And importantly, almost all of the key actions that are needed are at the state level. Okay? So our national policy discourse still disproportionately focuses on government of India. But 90% of these issues are constitutionally state subjects, right? So education, health, district courts, law and order, these are all state subjects, okay? And relative to the importance of the states, we paid much less attention to kind of what needs to happen to drive state-led innovation and action to accelerate India's development, okay? So that's kind of the big picture. Now, the reason for writing this book is that not just because I woke up one day and discovered that state capacity matters, but it's really a synthesis of a 20-year journey of research and policy, starting with education, and then in health, and then in child development, and then in welfare. And what you see is that in every sector, okay, I've been part of many global policy discussions, and in most kind of discussions, the focus is how do I increase the budget, okay? So education walas say I need 6%, health walas want 3%, police walas say I need more money. Everybody needs more money, okay? But there's basically two problems with this. The first is we don't have the money, okay? Because the logic of, say, spending 6% of GDP on education comes from OECD countries with a tax to GDP ratio of 35%. Okay, we are at half of that tax to GDP ratio, 18%. Okay, so you just don't have the money. Okay, so it's almost like every year there is this elaborate dance between departments and finance, right? Where departments will ask for more money than finance will give. Finance will not give the money, and department will say, "Acha, dekho, paisa nahi diya, isliye humne deliver nahi kiya." Okay, like I mean, so you are kind of playing those games. Okay, like I mean, year after year, because there is no money. Okay, so the second reason why this is not going to work is that the effectiveness, okay, so one of the most important findings from 20 years of empirical research is how poor the quality of expenditure is, okay, in terms of the translation of budgets into outcomes. And that goes to opening up the black box of the Indian state and understanding how exactly money is converted into outcomes, okay. So the good news, and the reason for writing the book, is that a common theme across 20 years of work across sectors is that we find that the return on investment, and that's why it's important for the finance people to kind of internalize this, that the return on investment of better governance is often 10 to 20 times higher than simply spending more money in a business as usual way. Okay? But the problem is that is long term and not immediately visible. Okay? And so that's why we keep doing business as usual. But what the data and the evidence tell us is that you can do dramatically better, okay, if you pay more attention to cost effectiveness and governance. So I can spend like 2 hours literally on this half a slide, okay, but this is essentially flashing before you 20 years of research. Each of these papers, I think Parminder today just defended his PhD and he was, proudly telling me about it. But each of these papers, right, like I mean, reflects 8-10 years of work published in some of the best journals in the world. But the punchline from all of this is remarkably similar. Okay, so if you look at education, where does most of our budget go? Okay, almost all the budget goes to unconditional increases in salaries. Okay, like 90% of the spending goes to salaries, right? But we have study after study showing that simply increasing salaries unconditionally has zero impact on outcomes. Okay, so I have a paper called Double for Nothing, where we show that even doubling pay unconditionally gets you zero impact. Okay, In contrast, even a modest amount of pay that is linked to performance, even a modest 3 to 5%, has a huge impact. Okay, so that ROI is literally infinite, because you can double and get nothing, and you can spend small amounts with well-designed performance bonuses, and you get huge outcomes. So the NREGA work was kind of even more striking. Okay, so what we find, this is one of the largest randomized controlled trials ever done in Andhra Pradesh, where we work with the government to randomize the rollout of biometric smart cards across 20 million people when they were rolling out the biometric smart cards. And because we know the administrative data on spending, and we have surveys on how much farmers are getting, or households are getting, we estimate that the ROI of the smart cards was over 10 times the cost. So the leakage reduction was over 10 times the cost of the program. Okay? And what was even more striking was that second paper in Econometrica, where we went and studied the impact on the market wages. Okay, so one of the key reasons for doing NREGA is we want to improve the private sector wages by having the government act as a de facto minimum wage employer. Okay, but what we find is that the impact of improving implementation was bigger than the impact of rolling out the entire program. Okay. So all our focus is on passing the laws and getting the budgets. And एक बार scheme बन गया तो उसके बाद like चलो बन गया, we move on to the next thing, right? But that improving the day-to-day implementation was more important than rolling out the scheme itself. But that is much less glamorous, right? Because everybody wants the photo of opening the new building. उसके बाद maintenance का क्या होगा? Like, I mean, this is not something that we pay attention to, and we see this in roads and potholes every single year. Okay, so but improving implementation quality was more effective than rolling out the entire program itself. There's lots of empty chairs here. Feel free to come. Okay. So I won't go through all the examples. Education, right? So we've got some really kind of high quality evidence. In fact, this is a paper featured at the front page of The Economist. Okay, so you don't get papers with more coverage than that. And we show that individual personalized education software can be dramatically effective at improving learning. Okay? But if you look at the budget for EdTech, 99% of the budget goes for hardware procurement, right? But that hardware by itself, we have study after study showing has exactly zero impact. Okay? So again, we have the ability to dramatically improve effectiveness, but in practice, the money goes in ineffective ways. Child development, this is a study in Tamil Nadu, where we looked at the impact of putting an extra worker in the Anganwadis focused on preschool education. Okay, just half-day shift for 4 hours hired locally. And we find a dramatic improvement in learning outcomes and a sharp reduction in malnutrition. And we estimate that the ROI, the return on investment of this, is about 10 to 20 times the cost. Okay, but where does all of our money go? All the money goes to unconditional salary increases of existing Anganwadi workers, and you don't have the money to then hire more people. Okay, so I'll come back and show you more. Anyway, so study after study. So the last one, which I'll just talk about by a postdoc of mine who got a PhD in Berkeley. This is in the case of justice. Okay, and so what she shows is she looks at district courts and the fact that because you get judge postings will get transferred in and out, and the average district court has about 5 judges. Okay, so what she shows is every extra judge clears about 200 extra cases a year. But because 70% of those cases are land and credit, okay, so these are factors of production that are being locked up from being productively used because they are stuck in the courts. Okay, so what she estimates is that the extra judge not only unlocks that many cases, but leads to a total increase in economic activity. That's about 30 times the cost of the salary of that judge. Okay, so again, these are 30x ROIs in terms of improving state capacity that we are not acting on. Okay, so that is the technocratic reason for writing the book. Okay, and the core of the book is really, so the reason it's a big book is it's in 2 halves. Okay, the first half is building an effective state, which is the core of what I'll talk about. And then the reason it's in that sequence is I believe that you cannot accelerate development unless we pay attention to these cross-cutting systemic issues of governance. Okay, and that's the second half. But before I get there are these 2 critical chapters, okay, recognizing the incentives and constraints of the 2 key actors that make up the state, okay, who are the politicians and the bureaucrats, okay. Now, in the interest of time, like I've cut out those slides to save 15 minutes, but let me just give you the high-level message, okay. The high-level message is that, see, at some level, it's very easy to say we are not delivering. At another level, it's actually very, very, very impressive, okay? And the reason, I think, so the key point to keep in mind is, remember I said we do great in some things and not in other things, okay? So how should you think about the crisis of state capacity when we do well in some things and not in other things, okay? And the key framework for this comes from Francis Fukuyama, who talked about the idea of what's called the scope of the state and the strength of the state, okay? So the scope of the state is the range of tasks that a government tries to do. And the strength of the state is how effective are you at doing what you take on. Okay? And the key lesson to keep in mind is that the scope of the state has expanded slowly over 200 years or 300 years, where for most of human history, the only thing that the government did was security and law and order. Okay? So for 3,000 years of human history, the state was essentially a security state. And one way to see that is 80% of your budgets went to defense and law and order, okay, till about the 17th and 18th century. It's only in the 19th century, along with the Industrial Revolution, that you build what I call the industrial state, where governments start building massive infrastructure, roads, railroads, ports, canals, to boost economic growth and productivity. Okay? So, and it's not an accident that happens alongside the Industrial Revolution. And then finally, along with that growth, you get an increase in inequality. Okay? And it's only in the last 100 years that you get the modern welfare state, where governments now start saying, I'm going to do progressive taxation and build a large base of welfare programs. Okay? Now, the reason I'm giving you this history is that historically, like the welfare states, in fact, I should have just kept those slides because the pictures are quite powerful, but historically, welfare states were built only after countries reached about $15,000 to $20,000 of per capita income. Okay? But the key other insight is that these three phases of the state are highly correlated with the extent of democracy. Okay? So the security state happens at a time when there are very few individual rights or human rights. Okay? Now, what's interesting about the industrial state in the 19th century is that happens at a time of limited democracy. Okay? The US and the UK like to go around lecturing the world about democracy. But in the 19th century, these were highly flawed democracies where the vote was restricted to white property owning men. Okay? So that was the class that then voted for the infrastructure. And it's not an accident that the welfare state happens only after universal franchise democracy. Okay? And that's because in any income distribution, if you're on the right, which is basically our tax-paying upper middle class, you want lower taxes. If you're on the left, you want more redistribution. Okay? So it is strongly correlated, okay, I mean, with democracy in the welfare state. Now, the reason I'm giving you this background is India is this incredible outlier in human history, that we are the only country that had universal adult franchise democracy on day one. Okay? And so what that has meant is not that the state has not delivered, but it has meant that the capacity of citizens to make a claim on the state has far exceeded the capacity of the state to meet those claims. Okay? So we are therefore chronically running around like headless chickens because you're expected to deliver more than what you actually have the fiscal and administrative resources to do. And therefore, both the politicians and the bureaucrats are frustrated. Okay? So the good news today is that politicians are increasingly under pressure to deliver. Okay? So, there is, of course, there's what I call the old politics of polarization, because every party has a base vote that comes from identity, caste, region, religion, language. But the good news is that gets you only 20% of the vote. Okay? The next 20% today you have to deliver. Okay? Which means that there is now political demand to deliver better for citizens. The bad news is that now the politicians are frustrated that the bureaucracy is not able to deliver and they keep blaming the bureaucracy. But that is unfair because that reflects 75 years of underinvestment in the bureaucracy. Okay? So that's why both these chapters are very sympathetic. Okay? That's why it's called the politician's predicament, that you are under pressure to deliver more than you can, and it's the bureaucracy's burden. So the analogy I use is just like the 1950s ambassador car was the metaphor of the pre-liberalization Indian economy. Okay? That, for 30 years we have the same car. So in many ways the Indian state is still like a 1950s ambassador, right? We keep on putting more burden on this car, but we don't upgrade the car itself. Okay? So the politicians are like your race car drivers deciding in which way to drive the car. Okay? But the car is barely moving. Okay? The bureaucracy are like your engines and body and wheels of this car. You're desperately trying to make it go. But you would rather be in a Ferrari than a 1950s ambassador. But there is no time to re-engineer this vehicle because you're just constantly trying to just make it survive. Okay? So putting more money in this is like putting more petrol in the 1950s car. Okay? Thoda aage badhega, but the translation of the budget into distance is really, really weak because we haven't invested in the structures of the state. Okay? So that is what the core of the book is about, which is building an effective state. So the point of the book is not just to say, hey, we need governance, we need state capacity, right? It's really to unpack this black box of how do you understand organizational effectiveness and how do you build a menu of research and evidence-based ideas that will allow us to improve the effectiveness of the state on a day-to-day basis. Okay? So that is really what I've given you so far is just the background and motivation. The core of the book is really here. Okay? Now, these 6 chapters, the good news is that these 6 these ideas, they apply to effective organizations in any sector, public sector, private sector, non-profit, okay? So in any private company, the first thing that drives all decision making is data, okay? What you measure is what you get. So every leader in the org has a quarterly target, and that quarterly target is what drives the culture of the entire company, right? People, how do you hire, how do you post, how do you pay, how do you promote? So personnel policy is in fact the most important driver of organizational effectiveness. The third key pillar is public finance and expenditure. How are you spending your money? Are you getting the right return on investment? Are you spending on the most important things? That's going to determine the long-term trajectory of your company, country, state, NGO. Revenue, everybody needs a revenue model. Federalism and decentralization, if you're a multinational company, you have to decide what are you doing in global headquarters, what are you doing in national headquarters, what are you doing in the field office. The same thing applies in a complex federal structure. What do you do in Government of India, what do you do at a state level, what do you do at a local government level. Okay. And the last part is state and market, which is kind of most companies don't do everything, right? Most of them will do a few core competencies and kind of get the other things provided by the market where there's a better competency to do that, okay? And the government faces exactly that same issue, okay? Now, there's bad news and the good news. The next 6 slides are going to be very depressing, okay? So the bad news is how badly we do, okay? Like I mean on all 6 of these things. The good news is that means there is so much low-hanging fruit that allows us to improve, and we are still doing well. Remember, we're doing 6.5%. Okay, so my grade for India, like I say in many podcasts and interviews, is like a good professor. It's a solid B+. Okay, which is well done but can do better. Okay, and I'll show you this with data. Okay, so like I said, there's bad news and good news. So let's keep that in mind. But the slides are going to be bad news, and I'll get to good news at the end. Okay, so let's start with data. So here is a simple, powerful but depressing slide, and this comes from a research paper by my colleague Abhijit Singh. And what this is showing is in a large Indian state that was very, very sincere about improving learning outcomes. Okay, they took it very seriously. They measured learning of every child every year. They designed the test papers independently. Top officers were involved. In fact, Niti Aayog in 2015 called this a national best practice of measuring learning outcomes. Okay, this was a very sincere state administration. Okay, that wanted to measure learning outcomes as a way of making sure every child is able to read and write. But what is the bad news? The bad news is that that graph up there is in the official data, organized from weakest kid to strongest kid. And you see in the official data, there is no child who scores under 65%. And then what Abhijit and team did is they went back and did an audit where they retested the same children on the same questions. Okay, like I mean exactly 6 weeks later. And the true data is here. Okay, so what you see is in the official data, there is no child below 65%. In the independent data, there is no child above 65%. Okay, so that just tells you how much the data has been inflated. And this is true in sector after sector after sector. Okay, so and this is true in high income states, low income states, middle income states. Doesn't matter what party, doesn't matter what region. This is there everywhere. Okay, where essentially like the gap. So even look at nutrition. Okay, so if you look at the official data on malnutrition reported in the Anganwadi system, it will often be 1 to 2% of severe malnutrition. In the independent NFHS, it's about 8 to 10%. Okay, so you're underreporting by a factor often of 75 to 80%. Now, why is this a foundational problem? This is foundational because it explains why we have wasted 20 years as a country, okay, when it comes to learning outcomes. Because since 2005, Pratham has been doing independent household surveys saying that learning is a problem. But the government, even if a joint secretary individually is convinced and sympathetic, will say that in private they'll agree, but in public they have to work with the official data, like because an official data there's no problem, right? So sab changa si, right? And we are sitting there in this kind of in this delusion that we are making progress, but we are in denial of the most fundamental issues. Okay, and same thing with nutrition. Our entire policy on severe malnutrition says if a child is classified as malnourished, the budget for supplemental nutrition goes up from say 5 rupees to 10 rupees or whatever. But if 90% of children are not classified, then you're not even going to start the downstream action. Okay, so the question is, who are we fooling? Okay, and we all know this, okay, but the data is foundational. Okay, second piece, then we say state capacity, right? But the problem is what most people don't understand is that the Indian state is the most understaffed in the world relative to its obligations. Okay, so in state after state after state where I go, people say, logi nahi hai, kam nahi hoga hai. Okay, and you see this, that the ratio of public employees per 1,000 citizens in India is 16. okay, compared to about 10 times higher in Scandinavian countries. And even in middle-income countries like Brazil, that's 5 times higher. In the US, that's about 4.5 times higher. In China, that's about 3.5 times higher. Okay. So, why do you have so few government employees? Because the flip side of that is, look at that picture, okay? And that's because Indian government employees, except for the top 2%, are the most overpaid in the world. Okay, so if you look at the difference between government and private sector salaries, it's typically 5 times the market wage. Okay, so these are teacher salaries coming from statewide data in Andhra Pradesh, where you see that the average government school salary is about 6 to 8 times higher, okay, that can mean than what's in the market. Now, so the problem here is you just have massive wage compression, where the top 2%, of course, like, I'm not saying that just to kind of make you guys happy, like, but it's true, that the top 2% are massively underpaid relative to what that talent will command in the open market and relative to the scale of the responsibilities. But the vast majority of government jobs pay way higher than the market wage, okay? Now, this creates many problems. The problem is not just of state capacity, okay? The basic problem is we should pay less and hire more, okay? We're not able to hire because we don't have the money. But it's a deeper problem than that, okay? The deeper problem is people don't realize that the single biggest driver of educated unemployment in this country is the government job lottery, okay? So that's because every educated college graduate in the country is wasting their entire 20s writing government exam after government exam after government exam. And that's because it's not their fault, because it's completely rational. Because the problem is not that the private sector is not creating jobs. Private sector creates jobs, okay? But private sector creates jobs at market wages. It's the government whose pay is so out of whack with the market that it is rational for people to keep on attempting that government job lottery. And there's a recent study in Tamil Nadu, okay, which has the best industrialization, best investments, one of the poster child for kind of investment in India. In Tamil Nadu, 80% of all unemployment among educated youth in their 20s is because people are writing government exam after government exam after government exam. Okay? Now, that is not just the source of unemployment, it is also the fundamental source of our skilling problem. Why do we produce millions of graduates every year who have degree thappa to hai, lekin skill kuch nahi? Kyun? Because the most lucrative employer in the economy only cares about exam taking and doesn't care about real skills. So, the entire education system is driven by where the returns are the highest, right? So the tail that wags the dog of the education system is the government job exam, okay? So now you have basically built an entire structure of people with degrees and no skills, and that's because there's no market incentive to pick up the skills. So I've now talked to so many skilling providers who will say people don't last for more than 3 months or 6 months. Everybody wants to go back and write a government job exam because you kind of disincentivize the constant skilling and working, okay? So personnel, there's a huge ocean of issues to solve. Like I said, these are just issues, but we can talk more about solutions in Q&A, okay? Now, here is a very simple picture of public finance, right? And it's one of the simplest but most powerful conceptual frameworks in the book, okay? Which is to say that when we look at government spending, in the private sector, you cannot allocate 10 crores without a discounted cash flow analysis of saying what is going to be the return on investment, okay? In the government, we routinely spend hundreds of crores, without even the most rudimentary analysis, okay? So the first thing we should be doing is just thinking about what is the return on investment of what we're spending on. But obviously, we are a government, we have social obligations, we're not just a profit maximizing entity. So you also care about equity, okay? But what you can do is you can take every major category of government spending and put it in this 2x2 matrix of equity and efficiency, okay? And what you will find is that there is so much variation in the effectiveness of money on these dimensions, okay? So now, reasonable people can disagree about region 2 versus region 4, okay? So an example of a reform in region 2 will be having a uniform GST, okay? So uniform GST will significantly improve efficiency of tax collection. It will reduce compliance costs, administrative costs, transaction costs, but it will be regressive, right? Because it would increase the taxes on the poorest, okay? So that's why there's an equity efficiency trade-off if we do that, okay? On the other hand, if you look at something like PDS, that's an example of something that promotes equity, but potentially at the cost of efficiency because you're running a dual price system which creates its own structures of leakage and other kind of distortion, okay? So, reasonable people can disagree about these two quadrants. What I want to highlight is how we spend tens of thousands of crores every single year on areas that are bad for both equity and efficiency. And because of that, we don't have the money to spend on the things that will improve both equity and efficiency, okay? So, if I was to just give you those examples from two sectors, if you look at just ICDS, there The unconditional salary increases of existing workers will be over here because they're already better off and that is not improving efficiency. But hiring that second Anganwadi worker will be up here because it's going to be a 20x ROI, so it's highly efficient. And it also disproportionately benefits the weakest sections of society who are using these government services. Okay, so that's an example of something that will sit up here. Okay, now another example from agriculture and rural development, and I know this is a sensitive topic in Punjab, okay, but the truth is that if you look at free electricity for farmers, that is probably one of the most inefficient policies we have as a country, okay, that sits down here in R3. Why? Because if you look at the land distribution, what we calculate is the top 5% of landowners get about 50% of the subsidy, right, because the subsidy is roughly proportionate to land holding. And it is a disaster for your cropping, for crop diversification, for your water tables, for, as well as kind of partly responsible for the pollution crisis in North India because you're growing paddy where you have no business growing paddy, okay? In contrast, you've got NREGA, where what our kind of research shows is not only does MNREGA benefit the poorest of the poor in terms of the landless laborers, but it also improves overall efficiency because it counteracts the monopsonic power of big landlords, and we estimate that the multiplier effect on the economy that comes from putting money in the hands of the poorest is highly, highly positive. So that's again an example where the research helps you identify that there are things that we should be doing that are here and things that, so if we can just focus on those two quadrants and build a broad technical and political consensus that the way you will deliver more with your limited budget is by at least politically, if it's difficult to cut this spending, at least stop the growth of this spending. Okay, and use that to fund the ideas that are sitting in region 1. Okay, so that becomes a framework that can be used for pretty much any major budgeting exercise. Okay, so let me quickly, revenue, I'll do this quickly, except to say that our tax to GDP ratio is around in line with where we are. But the bigger point, the economic point I want people to understand is this idea of quality of revenue. Okay, not just quantity of revenue. And that's because every government tax department is thinking about their revenue targets. Okay, it's like, how do I collect this much revenue? But you're not asking what is the effect of my tax instrument on the overall economic activity. Okay, so the key idea of quality of revenue, just like we talk about quality of expenditure, is that it is how do I minimize the collateral damage from the taxes I'm collecting, and that requires a much more sophisticated level of analysis than we typically have in most of our tax departments who are typically chasing compliance, because that's a tax design issue and we can talk more about that. Okay? Then federalism and decentralization. This is something that most people are shocked about, okay? Which is that one of the reasons our service delivery is so weak is that India is the most over-centralized country in the world. Okay? So if you look at this by budgets of what fraction of total budgets are spent at local government level, you'll see that everybody thinks of China as the strong centralized country. Couldn't be further from the truth. In China is in fact the most decentralized country in the world, that over 50% of public spending in China happens at the local government level. In India, that number is 3%. Okay? Now, and if you just go, if any of you have been to China, if you just look at urban governance in China and look at urban governance in India, that is 80% of your explanation is there. Okay, like about the people who have the resources and the authority to govern their spaces. Like the link between the revenue and the expenditure is tight to where the community is, as opposed to happening many, many higher levels. Okay. Now, and again, the bigger culprit is not center to state; it's actually state to local. Okay, is where most of the centralization happens, and we can talk more about that. Okay. And then the last piece is state in the market. And one of the consequences of weak public service delivery is that there's been this mass exit to the private sector. Okay? That education, health, security, private security employs about 3 to 4 times more people than all government put together. Okay? So just an example of how much the private sector is kind of taken over. Now, the subtle point here is this. This is not a bad thing. Okay? The subtle point is the government plays 3 very distinct roles in the ecosystem. You are a policy maker, you are a regulator, and you are a provider. Okay? And the way you need to think about the private sector is completely different in these 3 roles. As a policy maker, the private sector is your ally because you want to deliver for citizens, regardless of whether it's done by government or by the private sector. As a regulator, the private sector is your equal. But as a provider, you think of the private sector as your competition. Okay? Now, the problem is 95% of government budgets and personnel, maybe 99%, are allocated to government as provider. Okay? Which means you instinctively distrust the private sector and severely hamper the functioning of the private sector. I'll give you my favorite example, okay, of how distortionary this is to the entire economy. Okay, for 30, 40 years, since about 1960, India, with a millennia-old civilization, history and culture, used to get fewer tourists every year than Singapore, which is this man-made island of 3 million people that has nothing other than a man-made zoo and a man-made aquarium and a man-made island. Okay, so how is this tiny island getting more tourists in a year than India? And that's because our civil aviation policy for many, many years was basically driven by the need to protect Air India. Okay, that because if you open, so Singapore did open skies, anybody could land, anybody could pick up, and therefore you get this huge collateral benefit to the economy in terms of tourism. India, we restricted capacity because if you expand capacity, Air India lose market share. So the only way to protect Air India was to restrict total capacity. Okay, so that's an example of how policy ends up being completely distortionary for the public welfare because you're blinded by using your policy maker power to protect government as provider. Okay, and so that clarity of these three roles is something that is foundational to effective governance, and I don't know how much that is taught, for example, like in policy programs, and we can talk more about it. Okay. Now, I promised you I'm going to have good news, okay? So anyway, we have tons of research showing how governments think, like, in health, I remember, like most health secretaries even today, they think about their job as running the public health department, okay? But 70% of healthcare in India is private, okay? So you can do so much for the public good by making markets work better. But how do you make markets work better? That requires a completely different mindset and a set of tools that we haven't really equipped our policymakers to systematically think about. Okay, that I don't think there's a course anywhere about making markets work better. Okay, and what should be the policy frameworks for that to happen. Okay, so each of these slides, there is a whole chapter which in turn has tons of research. This is just a jhalak. Okay, now I promised I'm going to give you good news. Now, what is the good news? The good news is, as we shift to the second half of how do we accelerate, okay? Like I said, because there is so much low-hanging fruit, we can do dramatically better, okay? Now, this is one of the great debates of development in the past 50 years, okay, which is called the growth versus development debate, which in India was the Bhagwati Sen debate, okay? And broadly speaking, every development outcome you look at, health, education, safety, you do better in richer countries. Okay? So richer countries have better life expectancy, better education, and that's also true for richer states in India. Okay? So basically, when you look at this picture, what the growth wallahs will say is that if you get 2% higher growth every year for 30 years, like China did, that will take care of everything. Okay? Like you just focus on getting growth, okay, and you'll be fine. But on the other hand, what the development wallahs, led by Amartya Sen, famously says, listen, the point of development is not GDP. The point of development is human capabilities and human lived experience, and that means prioritizing education, health, safety, social sector. Okay. Now, at some level, they are both right. Okay. So what are they fighting about? Because more growth gets you more human development. More human development gets you more growth. So in practice, that fight ends up being more of an ideological fight. Okay, where the center right wants capex and growth, and the left wants social sector. Okay. Now, my point of departure in this debate is to say, guys, this is still at the end of the day a zero-sum budget, a zero-sum debate of budget allocation. The real opportunity is that the quality of spending is so poor, regardless of whether you're doing capex or social sector, that if you improve quality of expenditure, you can do more of everything. You can get more growth and more development, but that requires you to open up the black box of the government and how budgets are being converted into outcomes. And so that's how we move away from these zero-sum debates to saying, how do I expand the size of the pie? Okay? So here is one of the most the greatest triumphs of development in the second half of the 20th century, okay, which is what is called the shifting of the crescent curve. And this picture is showing you on the x-axis GDP per capita, and this is life expectancy, okay. So in 1930, this is where this was. In 1960, this moved up. In 2015, it's moved up even more, okay. So what that means is at the same level of GDP per capita, over time countries are able to do better and better in life expectancy, okay? So today's poor countries have better life expectancy than today's rich countries had when they were at the same level of income, okay? So the question is, what has enabled this magic? And the key is new technologies, right? Like, we've had new drugs, new discoveries, and so 100 years ago, the President of the United States could not save his son from a bacterial infection caught while playing tennis, getting a blister on his toe. And that's because there was no germ theory of disease, there was no antibiotics. Okay? So today, that is something a daily wage laborer like him has access to. Okay? So over time, most human progress has come from the creation of new knowledge, which comes from research, the transmission of that knowledge, and then acting on that knowledge. Right? That is how the arc of human progress has happened. So the question to ask ourselves in India is, what do we have today that today's high-income countries did not have even 20 or 30 years ago? Okay? And this is the source of optimism, which is what we have is much, much better data and evidence. Okay? So in the last 20 years, there's been an explosion in micro data sets, explosion in computing power, explosion in methodologies, including RCTs that have been recognized in a Nobel Prize. And so the body of evidence is what we have that we did not have 20 years ago or 30 years ago, correct? So all of this has happened, and we have much, much better technology, right? Like Aadhaar biometric ID 15 years ago was thought of as inconceivable. Just look at how far we've come. But it's essentially driven by technology and driven by better data and evidence. Okay. So the opportunity, where is the free lunch? Why is the book called Accelerating Development? It's because we have many, many very expensive policies and programs that have no impact. Many very, very inexpensive interventions that could dramatically improve equity and efficiency that are not being done because we don't have the budgets. And this is why you need the importance of research and evidence. Because in the private sector, I don't worry about whether Maruti is making cars efficiently because there's competitive pressure to do that. Okay? But in the government, you can waste other people's money for a very, very long time. Okay? Because you don't have that same kind of competitive pressure. So the importance of the research and the analytics to drive better decision making is so central, precisely because you don't have market tests and you don't have that market competition. Okay? So the value of the research is really high. So let me end with just one example. Okay? So this is like a simple slide from one of my studies on education. And I consider this to be one of the most important pictures to understand education in India. Okay? So this is a sample of about 6,000 students across 4 districts in Rajasthan. Okay, and what we're doing is we're just measuring learning. Okay, so the x-axis here, and this is same picture in Delhi, same in MP. So this is not to pick on Rajasthan. Okay, this is true in every part of India. Okay, and so what you'll see is this is the grade in which the child is enrolled in, and if they were at their correct grade level, they should be on the 45-degree line. Okay, but in practice, when you look at the learning, they are at this red line. Okay, so there are 3 insights here. First is that the average learning level in the school is about half of what is in the curriculum. Okay. That means your typical 8th standard student in maths has about a 4th standard level of understanding. But second and more powerful is the fact that because this is dynamic computer-based testing, we can exactly pinpoint the level of every single child in the classroom. Okay? So every dot here is telling you where about 10 kids are. And what you see here is in that 8th standard class, there are children at a 2nd, at a 3rd, at a 4th, at a 5th, all the way up to 8th level. So that is the kind of variation you have in the classroom. Okay, now think about how impossible the job of this teacher is. You're an 8th standard teacher, aapko 8th standard ka textbook aapko padhana hai. Like, I mean, but the majority of your children are not even at 2nd or 3rd or 4th standard level. Okay, and this is the unintended consequence of a well-intentioned no detention policy of pushing the kids through regardless of where their learning levels were. But now, why is this so important? Because this helps us understand why our education budget has expanded so much. We spend lakhs of crores, 8 lakh crores plus a year on school education. But learning outcomes are mostly flat. And this is the picture that helps us make sense of that. Why? Because essentially it doesn't matter if you're expanding resources, because what the teacher is doing is teaching at the level of the textbook. So, இப்போ இதே கிளாஸ்க்கு நடுவில் வந்து நான் ஒரு வேற பாஷாவில் பேச ஆரம்பிச்சா நான் வந்து எவ்வளோ சின்சியராக கற்றுக் கொடுத்தாலும் சரி, எவ்வளோ மோட்டிவேட்டடாக இருந்தாலும் சரி, நான் வந்து நல்லா குவாலிஃபைட், நல்லா மோட்டிவேஷனோட கற்றுக் கொடுக்குறேன், நிறைய ஹோம்ஒர்க் கொடுப்பேன், நிறைய கரெக்ஷன் பண்ணுவேன். ஆனால் நான் எவ்வளோ நல்லா உங்களுக்கு கற்றுக் கொடுத்தாலும் லைக் ஐ மீன் எவ்வளோ பேருக்கு புரியும், பாலாக்கு புரியும், ஆனால் பாலா கழும் பெட்டர், எவ்வளோ பேருக்கு புரியுறது கொஞ்சம் கை தூக்குங்க பார்க்கலாம், லைக் மீன் 4, 5, 3 பேருக்கு புரியும். எவ்வளோ நல்லா படிக்கிறேன் அந்த குழந்தை, நீ எந்த மாதிரி படிக்க மாட்டேங்கிற? So what have I just done to you? I have just given you 30 seconds in the shoes of a typical kid in a typical classroom in lakhs of schools around India every single day. That is the lived reality of our schools. Okay? And it doesn't matter, what did I say in Tamil? I said it doesn't matter how qualified I am, how sincere I am, how motivated I am, how much I am trying to teach you. If I'm teaching at a level that is far above your level of understanding, I might as well be teaching a different language. Okay? So, but the point is, once you have this kind of data, then there's no place to hide. Right? And And that data then becomes the origin of how you can do much, much better. Okay? So I promised you this is optimistic. Okay? So coming back to what does it mean to shifting India's Preston curve for governance, which really is the North Star for what we need to achieve as a country if we are serious about Viksit Bharat. Okay? And what this is doing is just saying, let's look at stunting. In 2022, we were at 35% stunting. Now, the good news is we are improving outcomes over time. It's not that outcomes are not improving, but they're improving very slowly. So even if you grow at 6% per year for the next 20 years, okay, you will end up in 2047 at a stunting rate of 25%. And China today is at 8%. Today. Whereas even if you grow at 6%, which is quite aggressive, 6% per capita, so that's about 6.5 to 7%. That's a signal for me to stop, I guess. Just get that back from me. Okay, so what you see is that if you continue there, you get a 25%. Now, even if you get your growth up to 8%, even if growth goes up to 8%, that only falls to 22%. So remember, that is an upper bound of what you will get from growth and an upper bound of what you will get from increasing the budget. Because growing 2% faster is the same as increasing a sectoral budget share 2% on a base of 6% growth. So you're not going to do much better than that. But if you improve, if you double the effectiveness of spending going forward, then even at 6% growth, you can bend that curve. You can bend that curve that gets you down to 17%. And when you bend that curve, you're increasing the chances of 8% growth because the human capital now becomes a force multiplier for growth. So then that increases the chances that you'll do 8%. And if you do 8% at double efficiency, then that falls to 13%. Now, doubling the efficiency might sound very heroic, but the book has a whole bunch of ideas where the ROI is 10x, not even 2x, 10x. So we have the knowledge. We just need to build the systems to be able to act on that. Okay? So same story on education, where if you continue the current run rate in 2047, you will still have 16% of children complete class 5 and still be able to not read at a second standard level. Okay? But that same logic, you can bring that to 100% in 2034. And if you integrate under that curve, it's not just about completing in 2047 versus 2034. That's an extra 120 million children. Because today, every year, 10 million children graduate from primary schools in India, rural India, without being able to read. Every year. Okay? So the welfare consequences of this are massive. And why do I focus so much on early childhood nutrition and school education? Because the future of these children is not yet written in the next 10 years. These are children who are not yet born. So their future is completely in our hands. The thing is, politically, there's much more incentive to focus on youth employment. That's because 18 plus vote, children don't vote. But by the time you get to 18, if you don't have those foundational skills, it's too late. Okay? So if you're serious about Viksit Bharat, this is the roadmap we need, where we measure and track every single year. Are we improving relative to what that trajectory would be? Okay? So to wrap up, basically the structure of the whole book is, for each of these chapters, so the way to think about it is, so Greg Mankiw, who was my macro professor at Harvard, he had come back after being the chairman of the economic advisors to President Bush. And he wrote this article called The Macroeconomist, a Scientist and Engineer. Okay? So part of your job is to be a scientist to understand the world. And then as an engineer, you use that understanding to build a better world. Okay? So the book is structured exactly that way. So every chapter, the first half is social science. The second half is systems engineering. Right? So there is a social science that tells us what the facts are, what the research is. The systems engineering is how do you use this to then build better systems. Okay? So those are these 6 pillars. And then it is applying them to these 6 critical sectors. And the nice thing about these 6 sectors is here you don't have to choose between Bhagavati and Zen, because they matter for both human development and they matter for growth. See, let me give you a simple example of the difference between Bhagavati and the Zen perspective. Okay? If you think about the instrumental perspective versus the intrinsic perspective. The instrumental perspective will say in education that it is rational for families to spend less on girls' education because girls' labor force participation is lower. Okay? So this is not saying they're discriminating. They are just being rational. Okay? They're saying, I'm spending, I need return on investment. But in the Zenian perspective, where it is intrinsic, then there should be no difference at all. Correct? So the point about these sectors is that every one of them matters intrinsically for human development. Education, health, safety, justice, basic amounts of welfare and jobs. But every one of them also matters for growth. So part of my goal in this book is we spend so much of our time as a country arguing, like Amartya Sen famously said, the argumentative India, is to, and because our public discourse is often so polarized, I'm trying to also find an agenda that can have a broad consensus between both the left and the right. And saying that this is an agenda that we care about, whether we care about human development, whether we care about growth. We can't get there unless we build a more effective Indian state. Okay. And then the last two chapters essentially says, so the technical, that's the core of the book. But the last two then says, listen, part of this is happening because incentives are not aligned between the key actors and the public interest. So how do you reimagine institutions? And again, the good news here is that, see, India built some outstanding institutions in the 1950s. But since then, we have not kept pace. And one of the points I make is, today, states are bigger than most countries. So there is no reason why states cannot take the lead, even in institutional innovations, institutional imagination. And that is how we will move the country forward, with different states trying different things. And then the last chapter is how this is not just about government, it really is about citizens and society and all of us coming together, because, you know, the government also has limited capacity. Okay? So that's really what this is. I can stop here, but I'll take one final slide just to talk about kind of what we're doing about it. Okay? Because it would be ironic to write a book saying the problem is state capacity and expect that book likhne se problem solve ho jayega. Right? It can be nahi hona. So, and in a way, the journey to building sieges itself reflects my time at the academy. And Tejveed has invited me multiple times, and I would be doing the sessions on education, and people would often say, can you please come to our state and do something about this? But as an individual, I can only go and give lectures, okay? And there's only so much that will give you, right? And so I did this for 5-6 years. I was honorary advisor in Niti Aayog. I've been on Chief Minister's Advisory Councils. But none of that actually was moving the needle, right? Because the problem is not policy. The problem is capacity for implementation, okay? And that requires a different kind of long-term institutional investment, right? So, which is why the logic of, like Tejveed was saying, walking the talk, right? Is to then say, okay, let's actually roll up our sleeves and help governments act on this agenda. And so that was the logic of building sieges, to help translate these ideas into action with Ashish. And the way we work is, it again reflects my 15 years of engaging in policy in different ways, of saying that even in government, people are often fighting in firefighting mode, that you're working on what is urgent and not important, okay? So, because the average posting is 18 months or 2 years, but this is a 25-year agenda, okay, that requires us to systematically reinvest in the deepest sinews of the Indian state. So, the way we function is usually with 5-year MOUs based in finance or planning, and the high-level strategy is a 3x3, right? Like I said, we focus on these 3 building blocks of effective public systems, which is data systems and data-driven decision-making, HR systems, everything from competency to, a whole bunch of HR-related stuff, and public finance, and trying to apply that to 3 key sectors of education, WCD, and health. Though we do some other sectors here and there. And now increasingly what's happening is that because there are modular offerings, different states are interested in different things, so we're able to test different ideas in different places. And so now in the last year in particular, there's a lot more GOI technical partnerships, where, for example, in measurement, a lot of the work we've done in some states, now we are the technical partners to MOSPI in terms of the State Statistical System Strengthening Mission. So a lot of these ideas are now being shared across states, like, through GOI partnerships. But the important point is, this is bottom-up. These ideas are all coming from different state-level experiments, and, I'll pause there and be happy to talk more, and really want to, hopefully energize and excite each of you to then think about how this frameworks and ideas can help, accelerate Punjab and Haryana's development if there's people here from there. So, thank you so much. So, what's our format for Q&A? Is there a moving mic? Yeah.
Thank you, Professor, for a most enlightening discourse. Our problem is not policy, but capacity for implementation. That is a very good takeaway. Any questions, please? Sir.
Good evening, Professor Muralidharan. My name is B.C. Gupta. I belong to the Punjab bureaucracy, a retired officer. So I feel, you excuse me, digress a little bit. Most of the people sitting here, either we live in Punjab, belong to Punjab, so we have worked in Punjab. So my question is Punjab specific. When we joined service, we were very proud of this thing. This is #1 state in India. Today, I don't know the exact figures, but I think it's in 20s or so, 21 or so. So my point was whether the governance is not effective, or the implementation is not proper, or the public spending is not properly managed, or the direction of development. So when I say direction, I mean whether the shift in international levels there is debate, shift from agriculture to the other sectors, whether it's required or not required. So are we really accelerating development, or we are following the path of retardation? Just one example I will give and stop. When I was working in Delhi, you have to face the parliamentary committees from time to time. All the MPs, 25 to 30 MPs, regardless of party affiliation, there used to be bombardment on me always. Why are you sending Punjab wheat to our state? Even a Odisha MP says, why are you sending Punjab paddy to our state? So these are the questions, I used to face there. So my point is, are we really following the path of development or the governance? What is the malady that is affecting Punjab, according to your perspective?
Yeah, no, I think is it on? Is it on? No, I think this is the right question that every serious thinking kind of resident of the state should be asking. So obviously I'm not an expert in the state and there's many things we can talk about. I think the biggest conceptual point I want to make is that the world keeps moving, okay, and that requires dynamism in both kind of policy, in thinking, in the economy. So this is, the good news is this is not just about Punjab. If you look at companies around the world, okay, so today, if you look at the Dow 30, the top 30 most valuable companies in the world, I think less than 5%, 10% of them existed 50 years ago, right? So the nature of the world is what is called creative destruction, correct? So that is what won the Nobel Prize this year, for creative destruction. So essentially, any society that gets used to living on its laurels in one particular way eventually faces a kind of stagnation because the world is constantly moving, correct? So you may have been at the top at one stage, but unless you are constantly reinventing yourself and moving closer to the frontier, at some point you will be left behind. So the good news is this is not just about Punjab, this is also true about companies, right? So see, at a national level, the history is again well known, but worth reiterating, right? Like, I mean, that in the 60s after PL 480, at a national level, there was this view that whatever happens, we will do what it takes to be self-sufficient and poor. So there were a bunch of policies, whether it was free, whether it was free electricity, whether it was fertilizers, whether it was APMC, whether it's BDS, all of these things in the food economy were put in place partly as a national response to the humiliation in the 1960s. So that made sense for 10 years, 20 years, Green Revolution was amazing. But then those dividends needed to be reinvested in other ways, which didn't happen, right? So fundamentally, I think that's what it is. Now, what is then the pathway forward? That's a complex, multidimensional question, right? So I think part of my other exhortation to policymakers and even politicians, see, recently I was with the finance minister of a North Indian state, so I was very actually pleased with the fact that he was asking me, कि कर्नाटका की आमदनी हमसे 4 गुना ज़्यादा है, तो हम क्या कर सकते हैं? आपके पूछ रहे हैं बड़ी बात है, लेकिन I'm very happy that you're actually asking and want to learn these lessons even across states in India, right? So the good news is that people are asking those questions. Then the politicians are asking the questions. So then as civil servants and intellectuals, our job is to kind of be honest that there is no quick fix, okay? It is not like tomorrow you announce one scheme and then suddenly everything is going to work, right? So progress is incremental and takes time and requires us to bend the curve, okay? Which is why, when people ask me out of all of these things, what would I prioritize? Because everything is important. But the place I would always start is in the finance department, right? Because the most important resource you have is how are you spending your money, okay? And in most states, essentially, the budget year on year is an automatic 8% increase, like the mean based on whatever was there. In some special projects, there will be some discussion, okay? But there is no concept of zero-based budgeting, like the need to go back and saying, can we examine from first principles, are we spending the money the right way? Now, eventually, that's a political decision, right? I mean, it's not our job to make the decision, but it's our job to ask the right questions and present the political leadership with different options of achieving the same political objectives in ways that will promote both equity and efficiency, correct? So I think if we are able to systematically improve the efficiency of the budget by even 1% every year, okay, that will bend the curve over 10 years. And if you can do more of that, then you can do that in every sector, right? So there's no shortcut. But that's why, I think I say this in the last paragraph of the book, or the last page of the book. See, it is good that many chief ministers are talking about trillion-dollar economies and growth, right? But one of the best-selling books on productivity was Adam Grant's, Atomic Habits. Not Adam, James Clear, Atomic Habits, right? And what does he say in the end? He says, if you look at successes and failures, the difference in success and failure is not the goal you set. It is the systems you build. That you don't rise to the level of your goals. You fall to the level of your systems. Okay? And that means doing the hard work to build better systems of public finance, of HR, of data. And that takes time. But, I don't really see quick fixes. Okay? So that's my long answer.
Thank you, Professor. Any other focused questions, please?
Yes, there's one. I'm audible? So I have a question about
the mic.
I don't think it's working right. Am I audible now? Am I audible like this? All right. My question is about success factors. So you work. I'm Amit Sharma. I'm a lawyer. I come from the corporate, but now I'm a lawyer. So I have a question about a success rate. So you worked about 6 years in different states. Do we have any model which you can share, and probably the challenges which you faced across working with the bureaucracy in India?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. See, the honest truth is, it's not like I have any silver bullets, correct? So part of the logic, so let me see, I'll give you another Greg Mankiw quote, right? So Mankiw had another great quote. See, the most important role of an academic is to be completely unshy to say, I don't know, okay? Because most things we don't know. So he starts his PhD macro lecture, okay, by saying that macroeconomics is a difficult subject. He says, you are confused and I am confused, okay? The only difference is you are naively confused and I am profoundly confused. Okay, so similarly, the way I think about the book and the way I think about CGIS, okay, is that the book lays out a roadmap of certain things of what to do, okay, but the book doesn't tell us the micro details of how to do, okay. So that itself is a joint discovery process that we are, frankly, as CGIS, we can't do anything without champion bureaucrats, who themselves are kind of really motivated to drive change, right? Because otherwise the system from the outside you can only support, right? From the outside you can't drive it. But the good news is that the kind of excitement and demand we're getting. So we started in Telangana and Tamil Nadu. Not people say, those are the easy states. We started there mainly because doing this work effectively requires trust, right? And so I had worked in Telangana so the current Chief Secretary and former Finance Secretary has known me for 20 years. And so a lot of the work happens because of the relationship and trust. They say, okay, you do good work. Same in Tamil Nadu. But I'll give you one example in Tamil Nadu, and in fact, they might host a conference now. So I'll give you, when we talk about finance, okay, so finance, procurement is an area, okay, where what has happened is that because we focus so much on kind of procedures, and a lot of people think procurement is sensitive because there's a lot of corruption, okay, but what the research shows on procurement, on government waste, is that only 20% of the waste is because of corruption, 80% is because of inefficiency, okay, and there is so much low-hanging fruit that is there if you can analyze that data properly, okay. So in one of the states, they basically it took us 2 years, right? But essentially analyzing every piece of procurement, right, in the state. And just finding so many procedural inefficiencies, okay? Of every step from the time a tender is announced to the time the contract is actually given, okay? And all we did was develop certain kind of early warning systems, okay? Saying that let's look at every month, let's look at where different things are stuck, and being able to bring in place systems to systematically speed that up, okay? So in about a year of implementation of some of that analytical work, we estimate that the average time from announcing a tender to awarding it has fallen by about 55 days, okay? Now that doesn't sound that much, but if you look at the total amount of capex that's happening, and if you look at the present discounted value of bringing that stream earlier, we estimate that that simple thing had a benefit of about 300 crores a year, okay? So, which is and the cost of the team to do that is about 3 crores, right? So it's a 100x ROI. Now, so the good news is it's a 100x ROI on my team cost. The bad news is 300 crores is still rounding error relative to the state budget, okay? But that's what I'm saying, there is no silver bullet, right? You have to put in place these systems that when you have these financial analytical units sitting in the finance departments that is systematically looking at bringing micro efficiencies, the aggregate impact of that becomes very high. So in fact, this was in Tamil Nadu, so they themselves may actually host a workshop for other states to kind of just walk through some of the process. So Telangana, for example, where I think some of the best work on data has happened, right? So how do you solve this problem of administrative data quality, the data integrity problem, okay? And I'll be honest, in Telangana, we solved technical problems. We have not solved political problems yet, okay? So technically, we showed how you can have these systems of data-driven random supervision to kind of flag administrative data issues. And we helped the government of Telangana implement the first ever district level KPI survey. So Niti Aayog had shown this could be done under aspirational districts because they did these measurements and surveys, but the problem was that was done for a few districts in every state. So, which means that it is an example, but you can't drive policy that way because the state doesn't have data for every district, right? So all we did was, in Telangana, worked out a system whereby you could do this survey for every district, about 1,500 households. And then you get district level annual data on every key development outcome, okay? So then that allows you to do budget allocation based on principles of what I call equality, equity and effectiveness, correct? So is your budget reflecting the needs in the most underprivileged areas? So that's how the data then drives that cycle of decision making. Now, but let's be honest, okay, since we're a bunch of bureaucrats here, I can tell you, what happens is that in many states that doesn't work, and that's because, if you, let me take 5 minutes, okay, to explain why this is not just a technical problem, right? It's fundamentally a bureaucratic problem, right? Which is, the problem with that data integrity that I showed you is for many years the government would deny Pratham data, okay, saying ये तो outsider है, हम इनकी नहीं सुनेंगे. Okay, but अंदर की data fake है, बाहर की data आप मानते नहीं हो, तो कैसे चलेगा? Like, I mean, this is a difficult problem to fix. So the way you have to fix it, the data has to come from inside the government but outside the department, correct? So that's what the planning department is supposed to do. Planning का job ही है कि, like, I mean, you are the custodian of data, but over time the capacity of the planning department is weakened so much that they simply collate the data the departments give them as opposed to apply their mind to independent data collection. So then in many states I said this, but problem क्या होता है? In most states, the planning secretary is junior to the health secretary or education secretary. He said, मैं पंगा नहीं ले सकता, इनको मैं दिखा नहीं सकता कि उनका data fake है, right? So in Telangana it happened because the finance secretary was also the planning secretary and was senior enough to therefore pull this off. Okay, so some of this is just kind of bureaucratic silo aspects of how you get it done, but the key point, and this is important, about where the CGIS value add in some ways is not technical, right? It is really procedural, okay? Because the planning department doesn't have the capacity to do the primary survey, okay? So, but what we did was we helped them write the RFP, do the quality control of the private vendor, and then we trained enough of the planning department's own staff that they could go do a random sample back check of the third party vendor. So then the department has the confidence that ye humne verify kiya hai, and they take ownership of that data, right? So some of this is really getting into the weeds of understanding silos within the government and how do you fix that. Now the good news, so the bad news there was we did some of the best work on data, but even there we were not able to push through the downstream action, okay? Because finance can only allocate the budget. Finance doesn't have the ability to often say how you will spend it, okay? But now what has happened in Maharashtra, where Vijay, who's the CEO, he is based in Maharashtra. So, but there, what happens now is the CM has decided to build a social sector war room. So their perception is that they've done very well on CapEx because they built a kind of a big infrastructure war room where they were tracking every single project. And they were like, humko ye social sector mein bhi karna chahiye. Okay, so now what is happening is that data is getting salience at a political level to then drive the decision making inside. So this is where I keep saying luck is when preparation meets opportunity, right? If you just have the technical capacity by itself doesn't get you there without the political and the administrative willingness. But if you don't have the technical capacity, then even with the political willingness, you don't have a solution. Correct? So the way I think about the journey of the past 5-6 years is that different states with different kind of motivated officers and leaders in different departments have kind of shown initiative to do things in different places. So we are also learning and expanding the feasible set. And the good news in bureaucracy is that, see, many bureaucrats, my assessment is that it's a very simple kind of, thing that there's maybe 10 to 20% in every system who are kind of reformers, want to do stuff. There's about 10 to 20% who will basically say, I'm not doing anything. And the middle 60% will go with the flow, okay? And so they're good people, but they're risk averse, okay? So which means that they will not get in the way. But that is why it's important that you find the 10% of champion guys to find one precedent और एक बार एक जगह कहीं करके दिखाया, then you have a precedent for the next 60% to say अच्छा यहाँ पे कर दिया तो मैं भी कर सकता हूँ, right? So that is how you gradually move the needle, and this is what Montague says in the endorsement of the book. He says the 91 reforms in some ways were easy because it required getting the government out of the way. Okay, then you just write it and say you don't do this. But the next generation of reforms requires the government to do better at what it has to do. And the project of construction is a much more complex project than the project of removal. And for that, you need a lot more decentralized experiments. Okay, so let me just leave you with one final thought. And I say this in the chapter on federalism and decentralization, right? Where there's this quote by a decentralization advocate who says the best way to solve India's many problems is to increase the number of problem solvers. Okay? So you can't expect that a PM or a CM or some kind of central authority is going to fix everything, right? India has more people than the entire Western Hemisphere put together. That's more than North America, Central America, South America, right? The average Indian state is in the top 20% of countries, okay? So we absolutely need state level intellectual leadership, state level policy leadership, state level visioning, and state level And the other thing I was very encouraged by, I was telling Tejveer, one of the states I went to, so normally I do talks like this for officers, but the deputy chief minister of the state came and said, ये आप सिर्फ अफसरों के लिए आप सेशन क्यों ले रहे हो, आप अगले बार आके हमारे विधायकों के लिए एक सेशन कीजिए, right? So which means that there is a desire to everybody understands that we need to do it, but like I say, the politician's job is so difficult, right? The kind of pressures they're under, where is the time to sit in, so they're driving the car, right? It's hard enough to drive the car, maintenance is one thing, redesigning the car is a completely different job, right? So that's why it requires all stakeholders to apply our minds and both come up with ideas and different kind of practical roadmaps. Sorry for the long answer, it's a good question, but hopefully that's something that others also within.
Well, I am Subodh Agrawal, one of the former chief secretaries present here, and most of what you have said are things that I felt but could not express as well as you have. Like this dichotomy between doing certain things extremely well and not doing certain other things at all or badly. And after my retirement, I was given another assignment, which was basically aimed at timely service delivery. And after 37 years of service, I became aware that I had possibly wasted about 37 years because I never looked at these issues as to what happens to a citizen who goes to a government office with an application. Even in the offices which I had headed myself, I was very happy if anybody who came to me went back satisfied. But what about all those hundreds of people who never came to me and who were dealt with at the lower level? I never really went down to that level and checked how many people are coming, how many. And thanks to this commission which was created, we were looking into that issue. And I think it made a difference a little bit. But ultimately the issue is that routine work, it doesn't get money, it doesn't get people, and most of all it doesn't get attention that it deserves from the people who are running the system. So if we can change that attitude that routine is important and we need to do it better, that's where people will feel that things in government are improving. And the toughest part which I saw in your presentation is this paradox of not having enough people and not having money to recruit more people because existing people are being paid too much by market standards or global standards. You use the metric of what is the going wage in comparable jobs in the private sector. One of our senior colleagues, Mr. Naresh N.C. Sena, his book compares it to the per capita income. What ratio is the salary of a government employee at a certain level to the per capita income of that country, and we again scored very high in that ratio. And in Punjab it's particularly worse, because Punjab pays even more than what the neighboring states, which have a higher per capita income, pay. So I don't know how we are going to tackle this. Seems to be the most difficult problem. So any thoughts on that?
No, thank you. I think those just wonderful, wonderful observations, right? So let me say the first thing, I could not agree more, right? Which is why the foundation of better governance is better measurement, right? So the routine, how do you start measuring the routine? And again, let me kind of give you the sources of optimism, okay? So simple example in the Telangana, where the government, when they did the Raitu Bandhu scheme of kind of announcing these payments to farmers, what we did was we set up a very simple outbound call center that would make calls to 25,000 farmers in about a 2-week span and directly measure by talking to the recipient about the average service delivery quality at the mandal level, which is the block. And then that data was used to tell the mandal agriculture officer that your performance is being measured by directly talking to the citizen. And this is the key point like you make. You see, what happens is we have grievance redressal numbers, but the way the government approaches grievances is from a solving an individual complaint issue as opposed to building a better system that will kind of, like you said, the people who never come to you, how do you know what is happening with them? In grievance redressal, you know who's coming to you. So the good news is that we now have the technology and the measurement to be able to have real-time visibility on a lot of things, correct? So that's why the measurement is the foundation. And I'll give you one more example I use in chapter 4 in the book. See, Amazon is one company, okay? One company, finance secretary, absolutely. So one company that has over 1,000 PhDs, 1,000 PhDs employed by one company, okay? And they have over 200 economics PhDs, over 800 operations research and data science PhDs. And what are these guys doing? Just micro improving how much time it takes to deliver a package, okay? Like, and how much time, how do you improve your warehouse management? So every micro improvement is driven by data, research, A/B testing, okay? So, and that one company has more PhDs than entire government, state and central put together. I'm not talking about those in labs, because these are 1,000 PhDs dedicated to operational improvement, not like, R&D. So the point is that it is possible, but it requires kind of a systematic mindset shift, investment, but it's possible. So the data, like I said, we've solved a lot of technical problems, right? What it takes is then the political will, and that's why when you say there's this commission, we can do these things. Now, the second question you raise, I'm so happy you raise it, because I think that is one of the hardest and most important problems. It's also something I spend a lot of time in the book on. So I do have some very concrete ideas, okay? So let me, if you'll indulge me, because this is something that shows up in education and health and police, even in courts, about how do you solve this. And the key insight is the following, okay? So what I'm proposing is the following, is that essentially that today the recruitment that happens on the basis of an exam, okay? Like, on which there is, and most of my research has come in education, okay? So what we see in education is that often locally hired kind of 12th pass or equivalent graduates are at least as effective, okay, if not more effective at basic service delivery, okay? So I'll give you an example in Tamil Nadu recently, where Tamil Nadu did the world's largest COVID learning loss remediation program, where they hired 2 lakh young women, 2 lakh, okay, like at the village, to do like after school supplemental instruction for about 1.5 hours. And we studied that and found huge effects, okay. So what is the solution? What I'm recommending is the following. Imagine the following slight modification. That today, the way you recruit a teacher is, the teacher has done some subject, done some B.Ed, and then is taking a bunch of exams. And if they get into government service, they're there. But if you look at the research, what we see in the data is there is zero correlation between having a teacher training credential and your effectiveness in the classroom. Okay? There is zero correlation. Why? Because a bunch of these degrees are fake. Aapne farji degree liye hai, so of course it doesn't make a difference. But the second point is, even if the degree is authentic, if you do a content analysis of the curriculum of a teacher training program, most of this is history, theory, philosophy, sociology of education, but remarkably little practical skills of how do you teach in a classroom. Okay? So what the global evidence says on any service delivery job is that the best training happens on the job. Okay? That you need the practical training. That's how we train our doctors. That's how IAS, there's a reason you guys all have like your practical training in the districts, okay? Because practical training is how these things get learned. So what I'm recommending is to completely rethink our skilling and training and credentialing system for these service delivery sectors, okay? Where you say that the government can start by empaneling and partnering with a few high quality institutions to build modular interspersed training programs whereby you're interspersing theory and practice, okay? Now imagine the following system. Okay, after 12th standard ke baad, you say, I'm going to take the best and brightest in every village, in every panchayat, and give them admission to this district level training program, where the government will pay the fees, okay? So today people are paying out of pocket. And what you do is you provide 3 to 4 months of classroom training, And then there is 7 to 8 months of in practice where you go and you work in the school and you're providing support to teach and you're getting practical training. Okay? So then at the end of 3 years or 4 years, you get a credential. It's a full credential. Okay? But now what you do, at the time of regular recruitment, you start giving extra points to people who have gone through this practicum program. Okay? So what you're doing is, again, it's a deeply thought through system which reflects the evidence on these contract teachers. Okay? But what's the bad news? So contract teachers were highly effective because they were accountable, they were local, and they didn't have permanent job security. Okay? But the problem with contract teachers is it failed. It failed for technical reasons, judicial reasons, political reasons. Right? Technically it failed because NCRT and NUPA hated the idea of untrained teachers. So the entire teaching establishment hated the idea. Judicially it became untenable because many states stopped regular hiring, and then you froze regular hiring, and for 10 years, 15 years you had these guest teachers, and then equal pay for equal work became a problem, and court should say aap regularize kar do. And politically, every time before an election there would be this pressure to regularize. Okay? And in fact Madhya Pradesh is a warning where in my All India Teacher Absence study in 2003, Madhya Pradesh was one of the best states because they had these Shiksha Karmis who were highly accountable, local and connected. Okay? But 5 years later when we went, it had become much among the worst states because they had this mass regularization in the middle. So then you regularize people like who were effectively much less qualified, and then you ended up stuck with that. Okay? So what this idea reflects is it reflects both the strengths and the weaknesses of the contract teacher system. And what it recognizes is that by making this a modular training program, you are actually saying you're not putting unqualified teachers, you're actually improving the quality of training. Okay? So when I think about my son when he was in the US at the age of 4, his preschool, there were 24 children, 1 teacher, but 3 teaching assistants. Okay? There were 3 teaching assistants. So each assistant was working in a group of 6 and providing the small group instruction that is needed for that early foundational literacy numeracy. Okay? So, but then that way you are augmenting human capital for service delivery. You are improving the quality of training. Okay? So that way training is improving. Then what you're doing is judicially you're saying this is not a permanent program. This is only 4 years. Okay? It's 4 years within your training program. Okay? And then for your regular recruitment, because you're giving extra points, now what you're doing is you're improving the long-term match quality of who gets a government job, because the person who has shown interest in that sector is now getting more preference compared to the person just a farji degree leke who's applying for every government job lottery that is possible. Okay, so there is a framework I've applied my mind to. In fact, it's one of the things that I think is multiple officials I've talked to say it's a really important idea, but doing it in practice requires coordination because no individual secretary can actually do that, right? So anyway, there are ideas. So what I really hope this has done is give you motivation to read the book and then engage with the ideas and then come back, and then, I'll be happy to come back and do more detailed workshops. But the best way to do this is not for me to tell you, but for officers to read. Okay, so here is a practical idea, right? So let me tell you something else. There's a beautiful book coming out by a political scientist studying 30 years of governance reforms in Africa. Okay? And what he finds is that most governance reforms fail. They fail because they are driven top down, and the moment the champion leaves, the idea is gone. Okay? So if you really want ideas to succeed, you need deep buy-in at different levels of the system. Okay? So the practical way to do this is to kind of, maybe get the book for all officers, get them to read, and then over 3 months come back and saying, here is a list of ideas. Okay? So what is it that people are excited about, that they feel will make sense for the state? Okay? And get every officer to list 3 things. And saying, what are the ideas I think make sense? What are the ideas I'm excited to be part of? And then you can create these little working groups, okay, of people at different levels of seniority who say, okay, we will now figure out how to make this and contextualize this. So that would be the long-term way forward, right? So there's no silver bullet, but you kind of have to build those structures to build deep engagement and then take these things forward. So, sorry, the problem with the professor is I can't give short answers, but hopefully these are useful answers. But I'm happy. I think the lights suggest that we're out of time.
Thank you, Professor, for the detailed answer. I think we have time for 2 more questions. Ma'am.
Good evening. I'm a retired professor of economics from Punjab University, Chandigarh. First of all, I must congratulate you on your book and your presentation. It has brought out a plethora of questions in my mind, especially in the context of Punjab. So I've been working on Punjab for the last 20-25 years, and we have a galaxy of policy practitioners here over the last 25 years sitting in this room. and I'm sure some of them at least will agree with me, that what do you do with the government's, meaning the political parties or the politicians who remain in denial? Because this whole thing that where we are today in Punjab started during the late 90s. The slide became more and more, it became faster and faster towards the first decade of this century, and here we are. So I'm sure many of you must have suggested, many of you must have come up with ideas, and we have been writing about it, talking about it, but the politicians remain in denial. So this is one thing. What do you suggest for that kind of a problem? It's not technical, it's not any, but they are in denial. I mean, they are not ready to accept the basic problem, which we know, because India is perpetually in an election mode and we are distributing freebies galore, and Punjab is probably the leader. Now, since you had mentioned Montague and the comment about the reforms, so when I was making a presentation to the 16th Finance Commission, I told Mr. Arvind Pranagariya that if we could turn around India in 1991, why not Punjab? I mean, it's not the scale of India, Punjab is just a state. But then, for that again, somebody has to come and try to do that without expecting that they are coming to power next year or in the next election. So now I want you to, my brief question is that how do we tackle the problem of denial? And that is the problem, that is the crux of the problem in Punjab.
Yeah, no, see, I think, so I think it was Governor Duri Subbarao, like, in his book where he says that when, bad policies will continue till they are unsustainable, and at some point, if it's unsustainable, it will have to stop. Okay. Now, the problem for states in India, okay, unlike the center, is the states can get bailed out by the center. Okay, so given therefore the political bargaining power of different states, etc. And sometimes I think, Punjab being a sensitive border state, etc., has often managed to kind of get a lion's share of central funding, at least in some areas, not all. Sorry. I just meant it in procurement. So procurement I think if you look at just where the procurement happens, I think that's true. That's not true in all areas. But I think the deeper point I want to make is that most reforms happen at the time of some kind of external pressure. Okay? So internally, all politicians, like this was true even in the 80s, right? So like exactly you asked the right question. 91 the reform happened, but it happened because of the external crisis. That meant you could not continue. The business as usual was not tenable. Okay? But it is important to remember that a crisis by itself doesn't get us a good outcome unless there is also a blueprint. Okay, karna kya hai? Because otherwise the crisis will just, make you kilo. So let me say a few optimistic things. Okay, so let us take this issue of farm subsidies. Okay, so and I spend a lot of time on this, and I think it's really important. This is one of the hardest problems we face as a country, right? Because you have to get the economics right, you have to get the politics right, and you have to get the trust right? Because the way to reform farm subsidies is to make sure that you are assuring farmers that you are going to get the same amount of money. Okay, but the money will come in the form of a DBT in the way that doesn't incentivize distortionary activities, so that you can diversify and do better things. So there's a whole kind of setup on that, right? But I think the best template we have as a country is how we did GST reforms, right? So GST took us 10 years, took us 15 years. Dr. Kelkar wrote about this, about what needed to happen in 2003. Then there was a process of kind of building a certain amount of consensus among experts. And then, there's a political process by which that happens, correct? So I think for Punjab, at a high level, I would say what is needed is a grand bargain, right? A grand bargain between GOI and Government of Punjab, saying here are the things that you're doing that are unsustainable. But if you commit to a certain kind of reform trajectory, here are certain financial incentives, but that is why it's not enough to just get the economics right? Given the political kind of challenges, you also have to get the political kind of alignment right, and most importantly, the trust right? And so building trust is so important in a federal system, and I think that is one of our biggest challenges right now. But if that's where civil society and others can kind of hopefully figure out ways of creating safe spaces for conversations, right? One of the things I've done in the past year, which has been really interesting. See, traditionally, thanks to Tejveer and others, I typically go and interact with policy at the bureaucratic level. I have not interacted with politicians till last year, right? But after the book, I've been meeting and I'm even more sympathetic, right? Because they understand at one level, because they see the problems on the ground, but they don't know how to architect a different solution, right? So they are also being evaluated by their voters on, are you getting me money? Okay, so which means the whole thing just becomes, how do I get more of this subsidy budget, this scheme, this thing over here? And this ability to think, imagine a different future with the structural reform is not there. But there's a willingness to listen. There is a willingness to listen, right? So creating the safe spaces, maybe where you have, in fact, I was joking now, that there should be a club of finance ministers who just meet off camera, because everybody knows that they suffer with the same problem when they have to balance the budget, which they don't face when they're So we have to create these spaces for these non-partisan national interest conversations, right? So what I say, every meeting I've had with a politician in the past 18 months, I say two things, right? I say, listen, I use the analogy of the ambassador car. I say, politicians can compete in which direction to drive, but building a better car is something we all have a common interest in, right? That's one. Second is, every great thing we've achieved as a country, whether it is ISRO, whether it's Aadhaar, whether it's atomic energy, has required continuity across governments, right? And so there needs to be a broad understanding of what are national interest projects that are allowed to kind of continue. And I think broad issues of governance reforms that are granular building of systems, I think is something where the good news is I have not found anybody I've talked to in the past 15 months saying, ye nahi karna, okay? Now, the bad news, so nobody's against this. The bad news is they are still under pressure of 10 other firefighting, that they don't have the bandwidth to apply their mind, okay? So somewhere in there we have to create these structures. So I think it's a complex question, and this is where we can't just say, hey, the politicians have to figure out. As professors, as opinion makers, writing op-eds, not just in English or Hindi, but in Punjabi, writing in the domestic, in the vernacular, I think that's really important. And creating spaces, maybe for some of these conversations to happen. And I think the other important thing I would say for politicians is to catch them when they're in opposition, because that's when they have time to think, okay? So then, because when they come into power, then they just have to kind of act, right? So the good ideas have to be planted when people are in opposition.
Good evening, sir.
Thank you. This will be the last question, sir.
Yes, please. This is last and short one also. My name is Gurpreet Singh Toora. I'm a retired public servant. My little clarification. The tax evasion, generation of black money versus development and fate of a common man.
Versus?
Fate of a common man.
Yeah. I think there's no question tax evasion is an issue, okay? But one of the things I say in the book, so that the public finance became so big I had to split it into two chapters, okay? Into expenditure and revenue, right? But the reason I put the revenue chapter after expenditure, there's two reasons. One is at a state level, your 60% is expenditure happens at the state level, but revenue happens more at the center, okay? But the other thing I say is that a government that tries to collect tax revenue while wasting hundreds of thousands of crores of taxpayer money functions with diminished moral authority to collect taxes, okay? So I don't want governments thinking about raising more taxes, until they first apply their mind and commit to spending that tax money efficiently, okay? So I think tax evasion, of course, it's a problem, but some of it is a reflection of the fact that the taxpayer feels that they don't get kind of their value for money and services from the government, right? So why am I paying this into this black hole that is the government, okay? So which is why I think one of the most important reforms for revenue, service delivery and governance in India is the property tax agenda, okay? And that's because, you see, that picture I showed you on decentralization, right? That only 3% of total spending happens at the local level. So the case for property tax and better local body revenues, there's economics, politics and practicality, right? Which is the politics of taxation is, and there's a lot of research says that people are more willing to pay taxes under two conditions. One, when they see the link between the taxes and the services. Second, when they have a say in how the tax money is spent. The problem today with our over-centralization is people feel that they have absolutely no say in how that tax money is spent, right? So basically but it's not just decentralization. Decentralization is kind of getting money, okay? But you have to raise domestic local revenue base, and then with property taxes, you are building a virtuous cycle between saying that there is local tax revenue, local service delivery, appreciation of local capital assets, and building decentralization as well, because you're building the muscle of local bodies to then kind of not just raise the revenue, but have the revenue on how to spend. So that would be like, what I would broadly say. Now, high level tax evasion, of course we need to crack down. Okay, I'm not justifying tax evasion. And the way you solve that is not by kind of raiding people here and there, it's really using data, right? I mean, so I think one of the things with the GST is we do have the ability to do much better analytics, but I don't think many states are actually using the data to anywhere close to the potential in terms of both kind of tax, tax analytics as well as tracking economic activity. So yeah, I'm not defending black money or tax evasion, but I'm just saying that most of the time the way to solve problems is by thinking about the incentives and the constraints and kind of moving the needle on that. So I think the property tax agenda is how I would solve it.
Thank you, Professor. It's a tribute to your not only domain expertise but your engaging skills here that we have had to put a guillotine on questions on an economics topic. Thank you. May I now request our DG sir to kindly come up on stage and present a small memento, a souvenir to Professor Karthik as a token of our appreciation. Reena, can you? Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. It's my proud privilege now to present the formal vote of thanks. At the outset, let me thank Professor Karthik Muralidharan, who is not only a theoretical economist but a development one, for his profoundly engaging talk. I like the way he broke down difficult topics. Thank you, sir, for a consummate review of not only an overview but a sectoral and chapter-wise breakup of what promises to be a very interesting work. I think our appetite is whetted. Most of us will read that book, sir. In fact, all of us, I think, will read that book. Thank you. I also thank our DG sir, who has been instrumental in sort of prodding us to organize this. Thank you, sir. It has been a most engaging talk. I must thank all the senior officers serving and retired of the Punjab government and other administrations who have come here and made this a very lively, engaging discussion. My thanks also to officers and managers from the non-bureaucratic circles, economist, lawyer, and all others who have made this such an eclectic gathering. Special thanks of course to Tejveer ji, who has done a lot of the heavy lifting in organizing this and in reaching out to ensure that many people attend this. Thanks to my friend and executive director Gulshan, who has actually guided us all in organizing this. Thanks to MGCPA team, Prabjot, Reena, Balvinder, Balbir, all the team members. Thanks to all who worked behind the scenes also to make this a success. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Good.